Welcome to the Home Rule Advisory Group meeting, November 8th, 2017, 10 a.m. here in CC8. We are going to check the remote location to see if anyone's on the line. Chris at California Air Resources Board in Sacramento, are you there?
Yes, we are. This is Johnny Raymond.
Oh, Johnny.
With
Okay.
ARB, and then Carolyn.
And then Karen Maliano is here with her.
Okay. Karen and... Okay. And EPA, is it Winnicky? Not on yet? All right, SCAG, Ping Chang or Roshang?
Dr. Lewis, this is Rumshan. Good morning.
Hi, Roshan. Glad to hear from you. Thank you for joining us. Bill Quinn at Seed.
Actually, Janet Whittick from Seed.
Hi, Janet. How are you?
Good morning. Good. Thanks.
Thanks for joining us and extending our reach all the way to the netherworld of San Francisco. And Mika at Compton Unified School District, have you joined us? Okay, he hasn't joined us yet. All right. Opening comments and self-introductions. Not sure I have any opening comments other than it's another Wednesday Home Rule Advisory Group Committee. And we stretch this out for 2 hours and lunch arrives. It's really amazing. So we thank Ann for that. Let's go around the room here and do our self-introductions. Phil just starts off. Right?
Philip Fine, Deputy Executive Officer, Planning and Rules, and may I wanted to introduce our new Assistant Deputy Executive Officer in our Planning and Rules Divisions, Dr. Sarah Reese. And you can, this time if you want, you can talk a little bit about her background, but...
Love to hear it.
So Sarah, go ahead.
Yeah, so real excited to be here. Just came here from EPA. I was at headquarters with EPA's Office of Policy, where I was the Office Director for the Office of Policy and Regulatory Analysis at EPA. That was the office that oversees all of regulatory development within EPA, as well as interface with the White House during White House review regulations. Before that, I was with the state of Washington. I ran their air and policy shop for the air quality program. And I have a background also in chemical engineering. I was an attorney in the Bay Area for a while, so I've kind of bounced around a lot, all of it centered on air quality. So super excited to be here.
Welcome aboard. You'll fit right in with all the other overachievers we've hired. That's great. Did you do work on our SIPs?
No, I did not work on
Oh,
SIPs.
darn. Okay. All right. Where are we? Terry, how are you?
I'm Terry Roberts with the American Lung Association.
Mike Downs, Downs Energy.
Laura Nevitt, SoCalGas.
Bill Lamar, Executive Director of the California Small Business Alliance.
David Rothbart, Los Angeles County Sanitation Districts.
Kurt Coleman, Executive Director, Southern California Air Quality Alliance.
And Pedro Piqueras, and I'm a health effects air quality specialist.
William Wong from the General Counsel's Office.
Great. Okay, so that covers everyone at, on the advisory group who's here today. That takes care of item number 1. Item number 2 is the minutes from our last meeting on September 13th. I always look to the Small Business Alliance to see if they have any corrections, comments, or notations about the minutes. But anyone else is welcome to jump in too.
Mr. Chair, under discussion under EPA and federal activities last month, 2, I think.
Okay.
Under discussion, it says Dr. Liu inquired if Matt Miyasato was advised of the DERA tribal funding. Staff indicated they would follow up.
I have talked to Matt.
Oh, okay, great. And then on page 5, under Rule 1466, I think there's a typo there. Mike Morris provided. Oh, Mike Morris's presentation.
What do you prefer?
I'm just guessing.
It's just one.
Which page is that?
Page 5.
Page 5. Mike Morris presented, provided. Presented, provided is struck. Anything else? Nice catch.
And then on 7, Under report from and to the Stationary Source Committee under discussion, this may be correct, but it wasn't clear to me. Kurt Coleman voiced concern about the pace of pushing the rules through committee without adequate time to review and provide comments. Staff responded that when we come to the committee, it can be to provide update. What committee is this? Stationary Source? Stationary Source?
Yes.
Okay. all
Yeah,
right.
well, no, it's report to and from stationary source, so it's all stationary
All right.
source.
Other than that, fine.
Yeah, I think that's actually okay. All right, anyone else want to nitpick these minutes? I'm glad you made those corrections, those are good. Okay, so with those corrections, we'll consider them adopted without having to go through the roll call of remote locations. And of course, anyone who would like to submit public comment on any of these items is welcome and free to do so as we continue to work through the agenda. We do have, has EPA joined us? I forget.
Hi, this is Winky Tack.
Hi, wonderful, thanks for being with us. We're on agenda item number 3, which is EPA and federal activities. Do you have anything to share with us today?
How much time do I have? I have actually a long list of bullets for you.
We've got time. We're waiting for lunch to show up.
Okay, so again, this is Winky Tax. I work in the air planning office and work closely with Amy Zephyr, who couldn't be here today. Nationally, no political appointees yet for the Region 9 Regional Administrator. As far as I've been able to track, we do have administrators now in Regions 2, 3, 4, 7, 8, and 10. Bill Wareham, as you probably know, was nominated as the EPA Assistant Administrator for the Office of Air and Radiation. I understand the Senate is scheduled to vote tomorrow on that nomination. And last national item, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards for ozone. We did some initial designations for attainment areas on Monday the 6th. I can send out some fact sheets and information on that if you would like. And we will be continuing to work on the designations for non-attainment areas. Are taking a little bit more time than we had anticipated to do that. Any questions on any of that?
Well, I did hear a rumor that there was a choice on the Region 9 administrator, but then it was never announced. So it'll stay a rumor, I guess, until then.
Care to share?
Someone we all know.
I heard the same rumor.
In the air quality world, at least, in California. Anyway.
Yeah, we have heard a similar rumor.
Yeah, I heard it was finalized, but then it was never announced, so I was kind of wondering what happened. But
Yeah, we haven't heard anything. I mean, I understand from some other regions that they find out the day that the person comes in for fingerprinting.
okay, well, we will stay on the edge of our seats.
Yeah, you may know before we do. All right, so air planning and rulemaking, on September 14th, 2017, we did a final approval of the most recent set of reclaim rules. That allowed us, in combination with another submittal from South Coast on September 20th, to publish a final approval of the 2008 ozone rack SIP. Both of those also helped us on October 10th to propose approval of the RACM and RFP demonstrations in the 2006 moderate area PM 2.5 plan, and we also signed an interim final notice to defer sanctions, which we're going to kick in next week. The comment period on that third action ends tomorrow, and we will work to respond to any comments that we get and then finalize that proposed approval of the RACM and RFP demonstration. On October 23rd, we did a completeness letter for the South Coast and Coachella VNC offsets and South Coast clean fuels for boilers. That also turned off the sanctions clocks related to a finding of failure to submit. Any questions about the air planning action?
Any other sanctions?
Winky, this is Roshan.
Go ahead, Roshan, go ahead.
quick question. So have we received any comments on the action for the sanctions?
We've received 4 anonymous comments. 3 of them are about greenhouse gases and wildfires, and one of them was a not very complimentary comment about Administrator Pruitt.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Are we kind of free and clear for the immediate future on sanction clock issues?
There's still a few on some NSR issues that are ready to open, but we're working really closely with South Coast and CARB to make sure that we resolve those.
Okay, great. Thank you.
On the air permitting side, on September 25th, we issued a synthetic minor permit for the San Manuel Casino under the Tribal Minor New Source Review Program. And then I think you may have heard this last time, but on June 20th, we concluded that federal PSD permitting provisions don't apply to the Tesoro Los Angeles Refinery Integration and Compliance Project. Moving on to grants, if there are no questions, there were 6 JERA competitive grants awarded in the fall of 2017, totaling approximately $7 million. I understand one went to the Port of Los Angeles and one to South Coast, among the other areas. And I don't know if you're interested in knowing what those actually went for, what kind of project.
No, I think they make it to the governing board sooner or later.
Yeah, so it's, the table I have shows that City of Long Beach Harbor Department, Port of Long Beach Marine Engine Upgrade and Zero Emission Cargo Handling Equipment Repower Project, $2.4 million. And then South Coast replaced 20 2010 model year compliant on-road short-haul heavy-duty diesel trucks with natural gas engines and transfer the replaced engines to Oregon or Washington for $1.05 million.
Yeah, change, but
Okay.
yeah, it was 2012 though, wasn't it? Then what came to the governing board last week? Yeah. Okay.
Okay, then the tribal DERA RFP will close on January 18th, and the estimated total funding is $1.5 million, and we expect to award 6 grants out of that money. And then the targeted airshed grant RFP closed on October 18th.
And did
And then
Matt say we were going to
just
submit?
one last.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Nothing, just checking to make sure we were trying to take, work with the tribes to take advantage of that DERA opportunity.
On the DERA piece. I don't know if we actually did work with them. I did mention it to Matt.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Anything else?
And then just three short technology things and one air toxic. But I understand there's actually a media event this morning for the Siemens E-Highway demo project.
Yes, I got to miss because of this. Thanks for rubbing it in.
And then San Joaquin co-hosted a press event on October 11th in Fresno, featuring an electric truck refrigeration unit demonstration project. Says here, the demonstration system was sized for a medium cold range suitable for produce or dairy product delivery. The system uses photovoltaic enhanced battery electric refrigeration augmented with a limited cold plate system to provide for 12 hours of chilling. Then there's also, EPA is working with, I think, state and federal partners in California, Oregon, and Washington state to facilitate alternative fuel infrastructure planning and deployment to support low and zero emission medium and heavy duty fleet operations. I think we're looking for South Coast stakeholder input on desired EV charging, hydrogen, natural gas, and or propane stations for medium and heavy duty vehicles and or non-road equipment. I'm guessing you guys are probably involved in some of those discussions already. And then one last thing, EPA's National Air Toxics Assessment is scheduled for release during the summer of 2018. We're working closely with states and air districts to review and QA preliminary emissions and risk data.
Good.
Yeah, that's gone sideways on us in the past.
Yeah. And that's all I have. If there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And I'll be around till about 11. I have to hop on another call.
Any questions or comments for Winky at EPA? Members of the public? Anyone on the phone? Okay, you got off free and clear. Thank you so much for the update.
If there's any of the Federal Registers or fact sheets or anything you want me to send, just let me know who to send it to. I can do that.
Okay. Let's see, that gets us to the interesting part of the agenda. AB 617 implementation. Dr. Fine, I'm assuming you understand this.
To the extent it's possible to understand it. So we have Karen on the line, and I think I'll actually allow Karen to go first, and then I have a short presentation after. So if we could load Karen's.
Which one's Karen's? The one with all the politicians at the signing ceremony?
This one.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, this is similar. So just to frame it, just so everyone knows, there's a flurry of activity between the agencies, CARB and the districts in figuring out how to implement AB 617 program. There's meetings on a regular basis, weekly, and we're working hard to figure out how we can implement this as quickly as possible and as efficiently as possible. And the coordination has never been closer, but I think I'll turn it over to Karen to talk about kind of the statewide approach, and then I'll get into more details about South Coast.
Great, thanks, Phil. So maybe we jump to slide 2, which I think all should be delivering on AB 617 goals. Is that right?
Slide 2.
Yes.
This is a different.
Oh, I got a different one?
Yeah. We just loaded this. This is slightly different.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, good. Phil and I were going back and forth on like how long, how short a presentation, so I wanted to make sure I was operating off of the one that you're all looking at. So, as Phil said, this is a new and very ambitious program that's really looking at how do we move, in addition to the strong regional programs that we all have been implementing, we know that there are disadvantaged communities that still have really a lot of cumulative exposure burdens. And so AB 617 is designed to have a suite of different tools, and Phil's slides actually go over a number of these that are designed to work together to make sure that we're having that specific community focus on making sure that there are emission reductions and reductions in exposure occurring directly within the communities that have those highest burdens to both criteria pollutants and toxic air contaminants. And there's a very ambitious schedule as part of this, both in terms of work that CARB has to do over the next year working with the local air districts, and then in the years following with the air districts really being on the front lines of implementation itself overall. But broadly, what we're looking at this as being a very collaborative process with us working together with local air districts, stakeholders, and especially community representatives themselves, because that is something that is certainly permeated throughout the legislation, that working with those community groups on coming up with the necessary solutions, understanding what the issues are, will really help lead to successful programs overall. When we think about how we do make sure that we're able to achieve the goals that AB 617 lays out, in addition to that collaborative process, just like with our regional air quality programs, having sound science that underpins it, but then also establishing clear goals and having timelines. That's always been the foundation for the success of those prior programs. And we certainly think that's going to need to be a part of this as well. The legislation itself doesn't specify specifically what those goals and timelines are. So that's part of our charge working together over the next year to be thinking through, how do we define those, as well as how do we make sure that we're looking at what kind of metrics can we be tracking over time to make sure that we're seeing the results that we need to see and that we're on the right path. And then there are also a number of elements that really relate to greater transparency and accessibility to information, both in the public process, obviously, that we always go through on developing these, but continuing to make that data that's collected in communities really accessible and meaningful, whether it's community monitoring data or emissions data itself going forward. So as Bill said, he's going to touch upon a number of the things that South Coast is very specifically tasked and working with on the near term. But I just wanted to touch upon a few of the complementary statewide efforts that we'll be working together on over the next year. So by October 1st of next year, which really means going to our board in September of next year, there are three key elements that need to be developed. The first is identifying which communities we're prioritizing. The second is a statewide sort of monitoring framework. And then the third piece is a statewide sort of reduction strategy. So if we go to slide 3, the community identification process is really looking at which communities have the highest exposure burdens. And in those, it would be of those, which is it appropriate that we want to look at deploying additional community levels and monitoring, or potentially fence line monitoring as well around some of the largest facilities that might be contributing to those communities, as well as development of community emission reduction or community action plans. And the focus here, of course, is on disadvantaged communities, in particular looking at, where are their sensitive receptor locations. So we're going through a process right now, working with the districts on, how best to do this identification, and Phil will talk about this a little bit more, but we are looking at potential nomination kind of designation process that the air districts could work through, because they have a lot of localized information that can be brought to bear, particularly with all the work that's being done at the community level within the South Coast. And then if we go to slide 4, the next element I mentioned was looking at a statewide monitoring plan. So this has a number of different elements. One is just looking at what are the capabilities of current air monitoring technologies. And this is one where we can really look to the leadership that South Coast has already established with the SCAQMD program, for example, that's already doing a lot of this work. It also tasks us with looking at where are there existing community air monitoring systems? What can we learn from successful models in that arena that we can build on for future efforts, and then provide recommendations on where additional monitoring actually is needed, as well as establishing some guidance on, as new networks are designed, what is the best way to be thinking about how you do it based on the objectives each network is trying to achieve. And every community is likely to be different in terms of the air quality issues that need to be addressed, and that translates into the types of sort of community and fence line monitoring that would be most appropriate. And then the next piece is the statewide reduction strategy, which is slide 5. So, part of this is starting to look at, and we'll already be doing this working with the districts and identifying communities, but how do you determine what cumulative exposure is and what the contributing sources are? But really importantly, looking at strategies for reducing emissions. We've had a lot of discussion and feedback as we've been going out and doing initial outreach. People are obviously very interested in community monitoring data, but it's using it to translate into action. So it's not monitoring just for the sake of monitoring, it's monitoring as a means to identifying what we need to do to reduce emissions. And then the last piece within the statewide strategy is then sort of outlining what the framework or criteria are for what these local action plans would look like, which is where the districts have responsibility for developing those for those identified communities. And as we starting this program overall, because it's new, while there are things that we can build from, there's a lot of things that we also have to sort of do from scratch. So, it may be that there's a program that builds over time, and this is actually in the legislation itself, that there's an annual process to continue to add communities over time. And so part of the initial efforts will be looking at, how can we, in that first round of communities, be able to develop successful models that can also be translated to a broader list of communities over time, because we do know there are a large number of them out there. And then I did also want to just touch a little bit about funding that at least has been being made available in the first year for these efforts. We know certainly that with this ongoing program, there's going to be a need for ongoing resources to be able to do this successfully, and so we're working closely with the air districts to be able to continue to define what those needs are. But one particular piece on slide 6 is the legislature did authorize $5 million this year for community assistance grants. And so we're still working through just what the scope of that might be used for. But, kind of a couple of broad areas. One would be for communities to be able to do their own technical capacity building, to bring in technical experts, to be able to have conversations about the program, but also just to be able to help them participate in the public process, whether it's traveling to meetings or conferences or being able to hold meetings where we can continue to have those discussions about the development of AB 617. And I did not have a slide on this, but the other big piece of the funding the legislature has authorized is the $250 million in first-year funding for incentive programs to help support AB 617. And I'm sure Phil will touch upon this a little bit more, but a large chunk of that, I think it's $108 million, is actually legislatively allocated to the South Coast for this program. So that will be really beneficial, both in supporting sort of early actions and a down payment on what needs to be done for AB 617, but also hopefully to be able to demonstrate that there is an ongoing need to continue to have those level of resources going to make a meaningful difference in getting cleaner technologies out there. And then just slide I had was a little bit on next steps and essentially how do we get from where we are now to next September in terms of what CARB needs to consider. So we have begun a lot of initial outreach. We had several informational meetings, including one with the district down in downtown LA last month. We gave an update to our board when we were down in Riverside at the end of October, and we're continuing to accept any and all invitations to come and speak to organizations, stakeholder groups, community organizations, and so we continue to want to put the word out there that we're very happy to be able to do this, especially as we're in this initial stages and sort of getting input and feedback on how we collectively develop the program. So our goal is to, by sort of early next year timeframe, have some draft concept papers that start to lay out what some of these planning documents would look like. We'll obviously continue to have workshops and additional community meetings. We expect to go back to our board probably in the spring timeframe to provide them updates. So of course they always have the opportunity to ask us to come more frequently if they want to hear about this. Within the goal of having some initial full drafts probably in the spring timeframe, with a subsequent draft in the summer to be able to come to our board in September. That, we recognize the program of this magnitude and being new, we'll want to continue to have a lot of opportunities to be able to share information and get feedback on the process and continue to work with air districts on community public engagement opportunities they'll be working through as well. So that's the big ticket overview in a nutshell, but obviously, as you know, we've been talking through, there's lots of details within that overall framework.
go to yours, do you want to?
Can I just interject one thing? Just
Sure,
so
go ahead.
everyone's not totally confused. I am the one that asked Ann to put this together for today's meeting. I was not aware at the time I put this together that there was going to be a presentation on EB 617, and this was going to be part of my report on the Environmental Justice Subcommittee on activities related to
You
EB
would nothing to talk about.
617. Exactly. So, but this is basically the presentation the CARB had on their website for their meetings they're having around the state.
And I guess I have a corollary apology that we didn't get this presentation out soon enough to the committee, but Ann will send it out.
Okay, yeah, I'll just email it
She
out.
can, right.
Bill?
Yeah, Karen, this is Bill Lamar with the California Small Business Alliance. I guess in looking at your presentation, there's a couple of things that sort of pop out to me. 99.2% of the businesses in California are by definition small businesses. And naturally, many of these businesses are in communities of color, high-risk communities, what have you. We hire from the people who live in those communities, and the owners of most of these businesses live in those communities. And I guess nowhere in your presentation do I ever see the word businesses. You do have a phrase there, all stakeholders, or at least in the presentation that I have, to collaborate or communicate with all stakeholders. But I think that it strikes me as I look at your overall presentation that that's more of a gratuitous statement than anything else. I really wish that CARB would take a second look at this early on in the process and specifically include the business community, certainly the small business community. You talked about community meetings. In fact, that's on your slide right now, workshops and community meetings. I would really like to see, and I think my peers would too, meetings with business organizations, business groups. We certainly have something to offer rather than just be the target of these programs.
No, thank you. I think those are excellent points, and you're right. I mean, it's actually, when we've been going out in some of our early meetings, community members themselves have brought up the same things, that community residents are often owners of the businesses, and as we look at incentive funding, for example, going forward, while this initial round was specifically targeted through our Carl Moyer program and addressing mobile sources, we know as we get into these communities, there may be many small business owners where some financial assistance in terms of mitigation or being able to reduce emissions would really be beneficial. And so we will be working together as part of that so that be able to address, many of those small business concerns. And again, we're also happy to continue to work with all stakeholders as part of this process. And if you have additional ideas on how we can be as inclusive as possible, we very much want to be able to do that.
And Karen, I think the legislation itself and even some of the plans that we have discussed include some working groups or advisory groups that will include industry or business representatives. Isn't that correct?
Right. The legislation actually says, specifically that we consult with a variety of stakeholders, and that does include, business and industry. And we're actually, had discussed with our board last month the potential for establishing a slightly more formal advisory consultation group, and that would certainly include business industry representatives as well.
Hi, Karen, this is Janet at Steve. Along those lines, and hearing about the working group, would they be formed before or after the concept papers? And if after, what is the best way to input in terms of scoping out the initial concept?
I think the working group, the advisory group would be formed before the concept papers, and so that may be a mechanism to be able to get input.
David?
Karen, I got a question about coordination between CARB and the air districts, specifically about potential overlap in requirements. So as someone that has to report to South Coast my inventory of emissions, and Philip may be addressing this in his presentation, but just as far as coordination between the different agencies, is there some type of thought process to make sure we don't have duplicative regulations where I have to report my emissions to South Coast and then have a separate reporting mechanism to CARB, and similarly, whatever backed and barked is at South Coast, how does that interact with what CARB's gonna do? Is there any kind of interaction between the different entities on how to resolve that?
Absolutely. So, and Bill will probably speak about this a little bit more, but we've already started our sort of interagency discussions specifically on emissions reporting and the backed bark piece to make sure that we have systems that are working together, that we're not being duplicative ourselves, but we also absolutely recognize, especially on the emissions reporting, that nobody wants to have a dual reporting system. So those are the conversations we're having right now is, how do we meet sort of the goal of what the legislation laid out specifically on having this more uniform system of emissions reporting, but also recognizing that South Coast has a long-standing and very robust emissions reporting system, and we don't want people to have to be able to report twice, so that we can work out maybe internal mechanisms to make sure that we can meet both goals. And the same goes for the backed barked work. Obviously there's a lot of effort right now going on in South Coast in terms of moving from reclaim into this system, and then how we can reflect what's being done there into the technology clearinghouse that we would be developing.
Thank you.
Kristen?
Well, I have a question, and I don't know if we should save it for actually more about the agenda to figure out when I should make comments. So, and you said that we were going to kind of go into AB 617 and the EJ subcommittee and Philip's presenting. And so could we go over how we're going to tackle the rest of this conversation? And then I have a question for Karen.
Well, Philip's got a few slides here, and he's going to talk a bit. Maybe we should wait until he gets done to see if we still have the same questions.
Okay, yeah, I think.
But I would suggest anything AB 617 related, this is the time. And
Yes.
then
Yeah.
if you're okay with that.
Yep.
Okay, you want to bring it up? All right, so there's a little bit of repetition here, but maybe I go into a little bit more detail. Karen mentioned the different aspects of 617, and from kind of a district perspective, we see it breaking down into 4 areas, maybe 4.5 areas. So one area is the monitoring requirements in these communities. The second would be these community emission reduction plans and strategies. The third are requirements for best available retrofit control technology and related statewide clearinghouses related to backed and barked. And the fourth would be emissions reporting and the requirement for a uniform statewide emissions reporting system. And I guess that the half would be on the first 2 here. There is going to have to be an effort to identify communities that may have monitoring and or community emission reduction plans. Not necessarily both, but it would probably depend on the community. So you can see here that there are all these different components. Karen probably mentioned them, but this is kind of how staff at the district level, and not just SCAQMD, but the other districts are looking at the requirements and how they may play out within our current programs, our current staffing, our current resources. But timing is critical. I put some deadlines here. The monitoring plan, the statewide monitoring plan that Karen mentioned is October 2018, but our first set of deployments need to occur by July of 2019. Clearly, it takes more than whatever that is, 8 months to deploy a community monitoring network. So we need to already have been started before, CARB has even finalized some of their statewide planning documents. And then there will be updates every year. So every year, you would assume that a certain number of new communities would come online, and maybe eventually a certain number of the previously monitored communities would come offline. But the timing of that is all an open question. In terms of community emission reduction plans, again, the same deadline to kind of identify the communities, and at the same time, kind of a statewide strategy or framework for developing these emission reduction plans. But we would only have a year from that to actually submit to CARB our community emission reduction plan. Again, if these are going to be what staff is starting to realize are mini AQMPs for each community, a year is not a long time to develop something like that and do all the outreach and get all the stakeholder input. And again, this is supposed to be updated every 5 years, but again, there could be some interim updates on that. In terms of the BART requirements, I think everyone involved with reclaim is well familiar with the deadlines in the legislation. End of 2018, a district adopts a schedule, and we are working on rules that will include implementation schedules, and then implementing BART by the end of 2023. That's what this. Part of this is also this backed BART clearinghouse. It has to be done at the state level, and I'll go into some details later that if people have questions about how that's going on. The emissions reporting, it's probably less work at the district level, but the issue that was just brought up is an issue that we definitely want to avoid double reporting. But if you can imagine, there will be, if there's a statewide uniform system of emissions reporting and the emission calculation protocols are going to end up being the same statewide, there are currently differences between the different districts. And any change to the way we calculate emissions has a lot of implications in terms of fees, in terms of rule applicability, and a whole series of programs that we run. So our first preference is not to have to change our current emissions reporting protocols, and I'm sure I think most people on the South Coast might agree with that, but if we're going to be collecting data that needs to be forwarded on to CARB, if that's the way it is done, and the way that CARB wants to calculate emissions is slightly different, we need to make sure we can capture all that information. And if CARB wants to do some adjustments at the state level, and again, how you communicate that and caveat all that is one of the issues we need to work through. So there's a lot of implementation issues for AQMD, but I've kind of divided them into kind of 3 general things. There's funding issues, and pretty much all of these are resource issues, but funding issues, staffing issues, and then these timing issues and deadline issues. So Karen mentioned the $250 million statewide from the GGRF fund for mobile source emission reductions, and these are Carl Moyer Prop 1B type programs. Karen was correct, about $107.8, I believe, million in the legislation will be coming to South Coast, a little over 40%. And the idea behind that is to get, get these incentive programs going and emission reductions early. And we're not going to wait for communities to be identified through the long planning process. If we're going to be successful in getting similar amounts of money every year from different funds at the state level and from the legislature, we need to show early successes. So there is work being done about how we can quickly get this money out, quickly get projects going, and going to communities that we know are going to be high priority at the end of the day anyways. So we may have to short circuit some of the process just to show that we can be successful in spending this money. And then there's another 27 million statewide for districts to do AB 617 implementation. And clearly all of the work that was mentioned is a lot of new FTEs at the district level, and CARB also got funding for new FTEs at the state level. They have a whole new division that Karen is heading up. They're going to be hiring. We're going to be hiring. All the districts are going to be hiring. Of that 27 million, it's still not final yet, but we should get up a little more than 40% of that. A lot of that, in terms of staffing needs, will go to the monitoring side, and then on the planning side, in my division, we need staff to work through these BART rules and implementation of BART, and then some of the staff will likely shift over this first wave of the reclaim sunset into the community emission reduction plan piece that is going to be ongoing. But on the monitoring side, it's not just staffing, it's also equipment. So there's a big chunk of the money we get will have to go to purchasing equipment. And then, so again, monitoring community emission reduction plans we see as the longer term staffing needs. The BARC staffing needs are primarily shorter term over the next year or two. And then there will be some other ongoing work on emission inventory and ongoing BARC and BACT work with CARB. So this is where we're looking in terms of staffing. There's also some staffing needing for outreach. You know, where we may need new legal staff, new public affairs staff, new IT staff. You know, it does kind of cover all our divisions and all our functions. And then finally, the timing and deadlines that are in state law and the timing of getting the resources, getting new FTEs approved, actually bringing people in-house and doing training. Suffice it to say that it's very challenging in almost every case to meet the deadlines that are laid out. Very challenging. It's not quite a euphemism for impossible, but we're going to do our best to get there as quickly as we can. Our approach to this, and this is my last slide, so I can go into some more detail on some of these topics. So first of all is the close coordination with CARB that Karen mentioned. There are weekly calls at the executive officer level. There are ongoing 4 or 5 working groups at the staff level working through these issues that we've talked about, and those are happening weekly or every other week. They're discussing funding, they're discussing the roles of the different districts, they're discussing the timing, the guidance, the planning documents that CARB is developing, the clearinghouses at the state level, and a variety of other topics that are coming up, technical topics, policy topics, et cetera. So the way that AQMD is approaching this is AQMD and some of the other, at least large districts, have a lot of resources that pre-exist, that go into either the monitoring piece or outreach piece or some of the community emission reduction projects. We have our MATE study, we have our clean community plan pilots, we have other programs with EJ groups that have already started some of the work. So our position is that we should utilize these existing resources to the maximum extent possible, utilize the experience of the districts to the maximum extent possible, and I think that would help us get a head start on some of these programs and also help us meet the deadlines. We have recommended to CARB, and Karen mentioned it, and it seems to be something that CARB is very interested in, is a nomination process for the communities. Rather than have CARB try to compile all the data that exists, maybe statewide, but a lot of it exists at the local level to try to figure out the most impacted communities, that the districts have a lot of this data. The districts don't have the same data sets either. So it's never going to be a completely uniform process statewide. So our recommendation was that the districts could, through their own public process, do a nomination for the communities that they think have the highest priority, maybe come up with a long list and then prioritize, do the outreach locally to those communities, and go through the whole process, perhaps bring it to our board, and then submit that to CARB and let CARB judge our nominations based on criteria that they have laid out in various areas, and then eventually the CARB board would give it its blessing or make changes. I think the process that Karen is thinking is that it wouldn't just be districts that can do the nomination. There would be a process that others could do so as well. But this would be a pretty substantial effort at the district level. We're thinking maybe 4 to 6 months minimum to go through this whole process. With the BARC requirements, I think that has kind of given us a little bit of an expedited schedule for getting to our BARC rules and getting those implementation schedules in place, and it plays into our reclaim sunset. And we would like to do this sooner rather than later to give the regulated entities time to plan and know what the expectations are in terms of when BARC will be implemented over the next 5 years. So obviously there's a lot of activity in this area. There's a reclaim working group later today and a reclaim public consultation later today. As we mentioned before, this double reporting of emissions could be an issue. I already got into that. We want to continue to assess our expected workload and resource needs internally. And we would like, whatever money we do get out of that 27 million to go in areas internally in the most efficient way possible. We want that, make sure that funding, both the 27 million and our portion of the 250 million, we can access quickly. As I said, it takes time to announce positions, get positions approved, even recognize the funding with the board, and go through that process. So the sooner the better, and the sooner we can do that, the sooner we can get started. To be quite honest, we don't have the staffing that is going to be required to even do this 4 to 6 month community nomination process without giving up on some other priority items internally. But again, it's really important to show early successes to make a case that the program is being successful and make the case for continued funding, because that money we mentioned is really one-time funding, essentially 1-year funding, and we believe that it's going to require ongoing funding to make this successful. And then again, the hiring process, starting work immediately is the highest priority. So there's a lot more details as we get into the details of each specific program. One thing I'd like to mention is on the statewide backed BART clearinghouse. We have been talking to CARB and other districts about this. For BACT, I think it's a little more appropriate to look at BACT as kind of universal. I mean, there's precedent in federal law for that, and for new facilities, knowing what BACT is, and many areas have requirements for that anyway. BART is a different animal. It requires a look at feasibility and cost a little more than BACT does, and it could be different from a policy perspective what BART is from district to district. And we don't necessarily at this point think it's appropriate that BART is uniform in that way. A clearinghouse does not need to say BART is X. It could say BART is X in South Coast, BART is Y in Bay Area. These are the factors that went into their BART determination in terms of cost effectiveness and feasibility and other things. So, that's still something we're working out, but it's a hard thing to be uniform on because there's so many other factors that go into BART determinations in terms of the individual policy bodies that make those decisions. So with that, maybe open that up for questions from Karen and I.
Kristen, do you still have?
Yeah,
I'm gonna consider your card still up.
Thank you. I mentioned to the chair that I invited staff from our Department of Public Health, and I'm sure Shelley introduced herself earlier when I was not here yet. And just wanted to make a comment that I did that because I went to the board's meeting and there was several comments from the Air Board's board about the role of the Public Health Department. So I thought I'd kick that off here and wanted to just tee up that the work that the county is doing in our Public Health Department on environmental justice and the interest to kind of, I heard that 617 needs public health input. Public Health wants to be available, so building that bridge for LA County, but I've encouraged the district to do the same.
So thanks. What can you tell us? Why don't you come to the table?
Sure.
So, because we record this and take minutes and everything, so introduce yourself and then Ann can get your name and title and everything correct.
My name is Charlene Contreras, and I'm with the Los Angeles County Department of Public Health. And the public health within the county, our board has a 5th priority of environmental health oversight and monitoring. And it's really looking at environmental justice closely throughout the county. We have various communities that we're targeting already for risk reduction and doing a lot of the work that 617 is looking to do. And so I really am encouraged by the decision to nominate. In that way, you can look at what the locals are already doing and leverage some of that work as well. And as to speak on the business side, I was just thinking about the same thing and how the business gets put into become a participating body in this process. And so what we found successful in our approach is that we treated the businesses as the community. And so when they're hearing the same things and they're sharing the same concerns, they become one with the community. And so we do have a lot in Los Angeles County, particularly in the Florence-Firestone area, where we have launched our initiative. We have a lot of data and a lot of moving pieces already in this area. So we would be willing and able and ready to like nominate that community. But I do like that you are looking at local initiatives, because there are many, especially I believe CARB Cal EPA does also have an initiative. They have several going on in Southern California, or Los Angeles County, and it would be great to just leverage those pieces for a little while anyway.
So I saw a news article on a motion that was going to be brought forward by Supervisor
On Kuhl.
Hahn and Kuhl, or Hahn and Barber?
And Barber.
Yes,
Barber.
about exploring what the authority was for the health department. Are you
Right.
working on that?
Yes, I am. It was a motion that was brought to the board, or came out of the board yesterday.
There is a section of the Health and Safety Code that says local agencies can adopt more stringent non-vehicular standards. I don't know if you guys are aware of that, but if it doesn't come up, I will offer the help of our council in working with you
That would be wonderful.
do that.
That would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it also says that the district staff is supposed to help them or provide assistance, or if they lack the technical expertise. So it's, it was designed.
Former district council can help you too.
It was designed to provide local governments the flexibility that they need, because recognizing that often one size does not fit all.
Do you remember the health and safety code site, 418 something?
That's great. Thank you.
And that just happened, right?
Yes, that was yesterday.
That was yesterday. All right, great. I think Lauren and Bill was the next two I had.
Thank you. Couple comments / questions. So Phil, I appreciate that on slide 3 you laid out the timing, because I know a lot of the conversations have been happening, and I don't think a lot of stakeholders are really aware of how quickly this needs to happen. And the law was obviously adopted in late summer, starting November, and a lot of action needs to be taken by next October. So I think that's really helpful to start focusing people on how quickly and all this needs to
As I
happen.
can hire people, they'll be focused.
I know you guys are. I don't know how much the public is. So one thing, I appreciated that you brought this up, was so CARB has to adopt the monitoring plan by October 2018, and then y'all have to do actually monitoring networks by July. And so I think, as you mentioned, the community identification process really needs to get going. And what you just added about 4 to 6 months and all that, I think is more detailed than I've heard. One thing that, I've been mulling over, and I think there's been some early talk about this, is what criteria are going to be used to select communities, and if there's going to be a nomination process, which I think is a great, collaborative way to get this all going. Both the nominations for those communities, some of that is a little self-selecting, so we want to be careful about that, I would caution. Communities that are, tend to be more active or have had more focus historically, there may be others left behind. But there needs to be some kind of uniformity for the selection process of the district, and then also what is ARB going to do? Obviously, you want to be able to anticipate how to get things going with communities, and I think, business and other stakeholders, it's going to be really important for folks to be able to anticipate where resources are going to be focused and what resources are needed. So I would just ask, I guess, what thought has been going into the actual criteria for that selection?
So again, this is an active point of discussion on one of the staff working groups that's going on between CARB and the districts. I think this is my personal view. It's going to be really hard to have statewide uniform rankings on this. There is Cal and virus screen, but there's a lot of other factors that are going to go into identifying communities, not just Cal and virus screen. And while we have MATES data, might have some other monitoring data, and San Joaquin may not have that type of data. Bay Area has some similar data, but it's a little bit different in their program. There's emissions data, there's Cal and virus screen data, there's our EJ definition data, there are HRAs that we have done over the years, there's MATES, you could come up with a list of 10 to 20 factors. And I think within South Coast, within a particular district, I think there is an opportunity to do some rankings and lay out things by a variety of different factors and risk factors and things like that. At the end of the day, there's going to be a long list of communities that all probably deserve attention. And then the next question comes with prioritization, because you can't go out and address 20 communities in the first year. It's just not going to be feasible. So how do we prioritize and schedule as these communities come in? And I think it's that prioritization piece that's going to kind of have that public process. It's always going to be a little bit of give and take. It's going to be a policy decision by one or two boards at the end of the day, but we can lay out kind of the facts as we see them and as staff. So, we could be as objective as possible up to a point, but then there's other factors that come into play. So that's our approach, and right now with CARB, we're trying to lay out the different data sets and the different criteria by which they would judge our nominations,
That's helpful.
or anyone's nominations.
I have one slightly other separate comment, which I also think is a big pressure point for everybody, is the funding. And we've obviously been chatting with Matt and his team about the importance of funding for near zero heavy duty trucks, and the $107.5 million coming in Moyer funding, and 40% of that is supposed to be able to be used potentially for Prop 1B funding. I think it's really important. It fits the goals of the AQMP. From what we've been hearing a little bit, there is not, the funding is not necessarily ready to be dispersed by ARB, and there's been discussion about that. I was wondering if you could illuminate on that a little bit, or what the current status is of how the funding is going to trickle out.
Yeah, I think there's only really two things I could say. One is there's a strong desire by all the districts, and I think shared at CARB, to get the money out quickly. And there's active discussions going on about how to do that, but it's not as simple as writing a check, unfortunately. So there's a lot of work. That's probably
I guess I have a
number one
question,
area of focus at the moment.
Phil, of where that check comes from, because I think there are separate pots of money that were appropriated, and this $250 million seemed to be directly appropriated by the legislature to the districts, not through Air Resources Board. Does it have to go through an Air Resources Board process?
I mean, Karen can answer that, but I believe it does, or that's how the executive branch is looking at it. But Karen, you want to weigh in on that?
Right. So the $27 million and the $250 million, right, both appropriated by the legislature through slightly different funding mechanisms. I believe the $27 million was through our Standard Sort of Air Pollution Control Fund. $250 million is actually out of the GTRF fund. Both of them come to CARB first, and then we allocate them down to the air districts. But as Bill was saying, we've been actively working with CAPCOA and all of the districts to be able to get an expedited process to get that money to the districts as quickly as we can. It'll likely be through grant programs, but we have existing Moyer templates and things like that to be able to get that money out of CARB to the districts, because that's where it's actually going to result in the action.
It didn't seem like there was a lot of discretion in that particular appropriation.
Not in the allocation.
Not in the allocation.
On the allocation,
Not
right.
amongst districts. And CAPCOA is working on coming to some consensus on an allocation for the 27 million. But that's not really the holdup, I think, is the district-to-district allocations. There's other things that have come up, so.
Bill, you have some comments on this?
Just a couple. We have our first budget advisory committee meeting coming up in less than 2 months. What are you looking at as far as additional personnel? I know CARB has, 55 or something like that?
50, I think it's 50 new FTEs at CARB and 22 temporary staff, something like that,
Yeah.
Karen?
Yeah, but they're doing it by just
Total
shifting people.
Total of 72, and a
Yeah.
third of them were permanent intermittent.
So that 27 million wasn't, a guess. We had worked hard with the legislature, and CAPCOA had, to give them cost estimates for implementation. And I think we got towards maybe a little bit below the low end of our range, but it's significant and it should go a long way. But we don't know yet at the district level. Let's say we get 40-some%, 10 or 11 million of the 27 million. A lot of that has to go to monitoring equipment, just capital outlays on monitoring equipment, maybe some capital outlays on data systems, because all this data has to be displayed to the public in real time. And then the rest is really most of it is FTEs for all the functions that I had mentioned before, as well as, legal, public affairs, IT, and other FTEs. But I mean, we've been going internally. It could be anywhere from 20 to 30 new FTEs ongoing. And it's hard because we don't have a guarantee that this money's coming every year. But we need to work out something that if it didn't come, we can handle it through attrition and the existing budget. So we're working on all those details. I don't want to give any specifics until we've kind of worked it out.
And that's a good segue to my next question too, is because you mentioned that this was one-time or one-year funding. And a year isn't very much time at all. So I guess my other question, maybe to pair it off Lauren's, is are you having any discussions and considering maybe an increase in fees or charges to individual businesses for these additional services that are now going to be mandated, not asked for, but imposed on individual businesses?
Well, so one of the things we heard loud and clear from the legislature when we were talking about the cost of implementation is, why can't you just go to your regulated entities and get it through fees or permit fees?
Yes, they actually included it in one version of the draft bill, right?
Yeah.
And our approach was, yes, maybe eventually. We just had a 32% Title V increase. It's not that easy to raise fees. There's going to be funding needed anyway. Doing community emission reduction plans or monitoring before you even know which facilities may be responsible for an issue that may not exist. It's hard to get cost recovery there. But we are working on Rule 1180, which is the refineries are going to pay for community monitoring as per another state bill, AB 1647. And then we've talked a little bit about all the toxics monitoring we've done, Paramount, Compton, and potentially other ways, and if there's any cost recovery type of mechanisms we can use either for specific facilities or in general. So nothing's been decided.
Bill, I mean, at least from the legislature's point of view, that proposal to force the regulated entities to pay for all of this had a life of maybe 3 or 4 days before it was right back out of the draft language, and there was.
But I'm saying,
realism.
funding, I can appreciate funding is going to have to come from somewhere. And you're a fee for services agency, so was it 63 cents of every dollar comes from fees, so it stands to reason.
Well, I encourage you to bring this up at the budget workshop, right? I mean, that's a good question to ask.
Yeah.
And not only that, if, we're hiring 20 to how many?
Probably closer to 30.
Full-time staff with 1 year of funding? Then you're gonna ask us to lay them all off in a year?
Well, one of the things we're looking at is if you look at our attrition rate, so some of that could be absorbed into normal attrition, but it doesn't solve the problem of actually needing to implement the programs, right? We need the staff to do that. And, I think longer term, we could plan for different priorities of the district, but this is all coming at once. At the same time,
I would recommend that you don't hire them from Coalition for Clean Air. That's just my request. David? I've lost 3 staff members to government agencies in the last 2 months.
To retract that email.
I have to admit, I stole one South Coast staffer off and have them on my staff. They're working out very well. I'll try to stop doing that.
Yeah, well, just ask Lauren over there. How this all works.
As far as moving forward with this, it sounds like the concept's laid out, generally what the objectives are, but as far as the regulation that would be established, some framework to say who's doing what, how that's going to be laid out, staff's it sounds like there's a hiring process, so there must be some thought process of who's doing what, who's responsible for what. Is that being laid out somewhere that we could look at a document or chime in a public process as far as how this should work efficiently?
Well,
right?
I think there's different areas. So I think potential regulations come into this in 2 areas. One is the BART requirements. You know what we're doing on that, right? That's a huge rulemaking effort over the next year or so, year and longer. And you will see our rule calendar for next year coming out in
a couple weeks.
coming out in a couple weeks, going to the board in December. And anyone could do the math and look at those rulemakings and look at my rule staff and figure out it's going to be a challenge.
You didn't have to tell Sarah, did you?
She knows, first thing I mentioned. So that's one area, but putting that aside, I think the concern is where these community emission reduction plans go and whether regulations are part of the emission reduction strategies in those community emission reduction plans. And I think it could be a part of it. It's not, but those are going to be broader. It's going to bring incentives to bear. It's going to bring some voluntary measures to bear. It's going to bring
management practices.
some other things, and rules may be a part of it, but I don't view it as, I don't think, my personal opinion again, is passing rules that only apply to specific communities has some problems with the way we do air quality regulation, and for many reasons I could go into in detail. If we find a problem that's affecting everywhere in the basin like we found in Paramount, we're going to pass a rule that applies to all similar facilities throughout the basin. So it may lead to some discoveries that lead to some broader based rules.
And where I was going with that really isn't necessarily what you guys are doing already. It makes sense with the reclaim and everything else on your calendar, what you need to do. It's more of 617 is really top down from carb down. So if there's an issue here, how does it get dealt with on a state level? Is there that kind of coordination saying, from bark here versus bark somewhere else? How is that all fitting together as far as what you're going to do versus anywhere else in the state?
So I'll let Karen follow me on this, but the state's obligation on these community emission reduction plans is to create some kind of statewide framework for how districts develop these community emission reduction plans and how they will judge them as they are submitted to them. I don't know how specific that has to be, but I would assume that we would have some flexibility, and each community is going to be different of how we would implement an emission reduction plan. And then another obligation by the state is in these community emission, in these communities, mobile sources are going to be, as we know, if not the majority, probably the majority of the toxic risk and probably some of the other pollutants as well. And we're going to need CARB's help in addressing some of those issues. So, and that's explicitly mentioned in the legislation that the emission reduction plans will include some state level strategies. But Karen, maybe you can give your thoughts on how that's going to work out.
No, I think you captured it well. I mean, in essence, if you think about how the Federal Clean Air Act has worked, EPA sets out broad requirements and benchmarks. Then there's state, local development and review, and back to EPA. This is kind of that same construct, but now within California, and that very community-focused lens overall. But as we go to each individual community, while the overall statewide framework would say, here's some benchmarks that need to be looked at. Every community is going to need a different combination of things to be able to really address what the challenges are. And in most communities, it is going to be a combination of both stationary sources and mobile sources. So just like the same way we collaborate together in terms of coming up with strategies for the AQMP, we'll continue to need to do that same process for these local community emission reduction plans.
Lauren, you're back again?
I did, sorry.
That's okay.
For seconds. Just one other quick question. Phil, you had mentioned the Clean Communities plans as maybe a potential blueprint for how these community emission, the CERP, whatever the emission reduction plans would work. Is that, dusting off some cobwebs about the Clean Communities plans, is that something that you're looking at as a model, and would that go beyond just the district? Is that something else that other air districts have? I don't recall that they've done similar work.
Yeah, the Bay Area has done some similar work. I mean, it's a good model in many respects. I think the outreach on that was pretty successful in the way that the community members were brought in. Susan did a great job on that. I think one of the outcomes was directing incentive dollars to very specific issues that were identified. I think it was a good model for identifying the issues that the community had in terms of air quality. It led to, when issues were brought up, environmental issues were brought up that were under our jurisdiction, it did bring in some other entities. And I think overall, it only led to one regulation that just passed our board last week. So it's a good model, but I think the way that these community emission reduction plans are gonna.
That wasn't an emission reductions regulation.
Right, odors. But a community emission reduction plan, I mean, that's one model that was a little bit looser. I think this is gonna have to end up being a little bit more formal and start looking like mini AQMPs.
Right.
Looking at baseline exposure, looking at the current rules and regulations that are already on the books that are gonna reduce that exposure, and looking for where we can go above and beyond.
Right, I recall those plans being very qualitative in a sense,
Yeah.
right? They're not really quantitative plans. But I think the point about if you were looking at a community emission reduction plan, you can't create regs for, a specific community, then you're getting really granular into even, more local government. So how does that balance out? The other thing that I liked about those, the Clean Communities plans is that they did look at mobile sources too, if I recall correctly. So it was how is a community impacted by a range of sources? And it sounds like that's the direction that we're moving here, even though the legislation itself is very focused on stationary and toxics. I think the initial impression for a lot of folks is that this was going to be stationary source only. Obviously, I think a lot of stakeholders would encourage that mobile source impacts are, as significant, if not more.
And I think the legislation does give a shout out to mobile sources in many locations. And if you have been at any of the CARB workshops, they acknowledge that.
Yes.
If you went to the CARB meeting in Riverside, it's all, we all understand that's a big, not the major piece of this. And even though 415 was not emission reduction or toxic reduction tool, if we're in a community and that's a major issue and we have jurisdiction over it, we're not going to say that, sorry, it doesn't fit within the framework of AB 617. We're going to try to, improve quality of life where we can.
Okay, round two, Bill Lamar.
No, I was just going to comment several things about clean communities. It did involve the business community or business representatives. I know I was drafted, but nevertheless, I did participate in both Boyle Heights and San Bernardino. The other thing that it did, it helped to identify a lot of unpermitted sources in these communities. I know that we went down many an alleyway and street and all these other circuitous routes in these communities and found businesses that probably didn't even have a business permit, let alone a district permit. So, it did have its good features to it.
Any other questions or comments? Anyone on the phone?
Yes, this is Janet from Steve again. And Karen, I have a question about the statewide prioritization. If the districts are going to nominate and prioritize within the region, will ARB be looking at prioritizing statewide or helping to prioritize within the region? And as I would assume that if you were to do a statewide prioritization, you would end up seeing a lot of communities in a couple of air basins and maybe not so many in others, versus a regional kind of prioritization might be more evenly spread out. But again, you might be working on communities in one region that really aren't proportionately impacted compared to a number in like South Coast or San Joaquin Valley.
Good question. It's probably ultimately a little bit of both. We know that pushing this down to looking at regional prioritization is beneficial because, as we've been talking about, there's a lot of local knowledge that can be brought into this to really help prioritize communities within a region. But at the same time, we probably actually do want some regional diversity as part of the program as we start, because it's an ability to be able to capture some different kinds of communities. As we've been talking about here, we probably need to start smaller as we begin the program, but we want to be able to establish something that can be transferred to additional communities over time. And so being able to have some variety of the different air quality challenges and different kinds of sources in this round, I think will also be beneficial and being able to have some lessons learned as we build the program over time.
Okay, anyone else on the phone? Any questions, comments?
Yeah. Hi, Dr. Ludoya, this is Rongshen. Actually, I have 3 questions. One for Karen. Hi, Karen, you mentioned earlier that ARB is going to develop some concept paper, but does ARB plan to develop any kind of guidelines with regard to the AB 617 implementation?
The guidelines really are part of, for example, the statewide strategy or the monitoring strategy themselves. So not guidelines overall on how we move forward, but there will be guidelines embedded within the individual documents themselves. Is that kind of what you were getting at, Rongshen?
Yes. Thank you for that clarification. And the second question, maybe also for you, the $250 million for mobile sources only, are there any funding for stationary sources?
Not in the first round because it's statutorily focused on Moyer and then a recognition of Prop 1B. Where there's a little bit of element of stationary source element in Moyer, it is primarily mobile sources. But going forward, and I think this goes back to the comment Bill Lamar was making about, there are many, many small businesses within these communities. And then as we identify, what kinds of solutions might be needed, I think we would all really want to be able to expand the role of that incentive funding over time to also be able to potentially address and help out small business owners if they're, stationary sources as well as mobile sources.
Okay.
So
thank you, Karen. My last question is more for Phil. Hi, Phil. The SIP AQMP is really regional perspective, while the AB 617 is more focused on community level. So how do you see the AB 617 implementation relate to the implementation of the 2016 AQMP, especially in 2 perspectives? One is in terms of the SIP credits. As we know, the AQMP has specific measures with specific associated emission reductions. So does the implementation of AB 617 kind of complement to that? Can we take kind of additional SIP credits from this implementation? So that's one. Second, how this relates to the facility-based measures?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question, and I think the one area that's clear at this point that has that overlap is as incentives are brought to bear and our AQMP laid them out in a more general sense, and now it appears that they're going to be more geographically focused, but it's really the same incentives that we were looking for. So I think even if they are focused in these communities, the same issues apply about making sure that we can get SIP credit for incentive programs or other voluntary programs that were already anticipated in the AQMP. I think the only thing that's really changed here is that we may see more of a kind of a community-based geographical focus for some of those measures, but wherever they occur, they still may be SIP creditable. I think on the regulatory side of the AQMP, it's a little bit less clear of how this ties together with AB 617. But there may be some regulations that come out of this effort at the state or local level that will help achieve AQMP goals. I think that was your second question. Was there another one I missed?
No,
That's it.
And
yeah.
On your previous...
The second question, because Air District has been having the facility-based measure working groups.
Yeah.
So that's the ongoing effort. So I try to see how the AB 617 implementation relate to that effort, because a lot of the communities that we can expect those that would be impacted are really maybe next or around those heavy polluting facilities.
Yeah, so I think I think there is overlap there. I think Karen could probably speak to it in more detail. I think CARB is holding a joint workshop in San Diego for AB 617 implementation and freight-related measures. So there is going to be some overlap there. And again, the approaches aren't necessarily different approaches. It's a similar approach, but coming at it from two different kind of policy directions. So I think there's some overlap there. And I did want to mention a previous question to Karen was that the district is working towards putting together, using some of our special funds that have been accumulating over the years from settlements and mitigation fees to put together a package on stationary source incentive funding.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Bill.
I
And
do
Karen
have,
too.
I have a list of things I've been making notes of throughout this, so it might not all flow quite together, but it has, issues have all come up. On the business side of things and the barked and backed requirements, I think this is not only, something for Bill to lose sleep over, but it's also an opportunity for the good actors to really get recognized and celebrated to some extent, because someone has established these backed, standards, right? Someone went out and did it, and there are going to be people who have invested in retrofit control technologies who should be, we should spend time also trying to point out to the communities who the good actors are and who have gone beyond and who are using best management practices even when they're not regulatorily required. And so, I think there will be some stick involved, but I want to make sure there's some carrot also for the businesses, because I could see how it would be very disconcerting to a small business if they thought they were just being set up to be targeted through this program. I don't think that was the intent. In terms of timing, I'm not sure I heard it correctly or if I'm clear on it, but we have this need to spend or encumber this money very quickly. And it seems to me like we may not even have identified the communities by the time we need to have spent the money. Is that possible?
I think for the long term that's true. So there is a discussion going on about, for this first round of at least the incentive funding piece,
Right.
Are there some kind of like no-brainer projects?
I think we can agree on those.
There's
Yeah.
certain communities, no one's going to argue that they're impacted by mobile sources. So we're working with CARB to see if there's some early actions that can help get that money out before the full process for the community.
Exactly. We really do have to establish that we can spend that money wisely and earn the trust and faith of the legislature and the governor, the next governor, this governor, that we can do that right. So let's see, the next one was this possibility that some community may feel like they're left behind. And I think that are a couple of things to that. One is that we have to really take a long view of this, because this legislation isn't going anywhere, and it is going to take time to get to all the communities that we think are deserving. And I think everyone has to recognize that it's not happening overnight, and there are not going to be communities left behind. It just may take a longer period of time to get that focused attention that these first communities will be getting, right, when we identify them. And also in terms of the identification of the communities, I think in part you kind of need to have some degree of community capacity and engagement already and familiarity with what's going on, because if you're trying to start from building that community capacity and supporting that community capacity and then getting them up to speed and then having them engage and then having them continue to engage over time, which, as we've seen with Clean Communities Plan, can be difficult, that's going to make it even harder than it is already. There are lots of communities who are very much deserving, who are already well organized, already engaged, already wanting to take advantage of this, and they're participating in the ARB process too. So to make sure that we get this going as quickly as possible, we probably need to consider what the existing community capacity engagement is.
That's one of the criteria that CARB has been putting on their preliminary list.
I may or may not have mentioned that to Judy, so that it got to be part of that. The data systems question, I'm wondering if the investment we've already committed to doing in Torrance around the refinery might be able to help sort of, I was hoping that data analytical and communications system was going to be a more general platform that could be used outside of just Torrance.
That's likely. The platform it's using is actually a platform that we are also using for our data management systems that we helped develop with the same contractor years ago. And that's kind of the underlying database structure. The user interface is obviously might be different for that project. But yeah, those types of systems can be
Well, we
scaled
should
up.
also make sure it's something that other people can use. And well, anyway, there might be some cost savings involved.
Yeah, absolutely. We would like to have one system that collects all this data from everywhere, at least in the basin, and CARB can have access to, and maybe have even a statewide website that people can choose what community data they want to look at, or look at all of it, and kind of integrate the whole thing.
Yeah. And then the last thing about quantification and stuff, and I'm all for it. I think we need to, if we get creditable emission reductions, yes, absolutely. They're real and enforceable and quantitative and all that, permanent and surplus. Great, let's get those. But I think we also have to appreciate the fact that some of this is going to be qualitative. It's going to be difficult. Some of it, it's just like using some of the investments from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund for transportation and affordable housing and stuff like that. It's much more difficult to quantify those, but we do know that there are benefits. So we're going to run into a lot of this. I think we should measure, track, and quantify what we can, but also not be afraid to pursue things that we inherently know will lead to qualitatively better situations for the communities. So those are my list of 5 items after all this conversation. It's quite a conversation.
Dr. Lou, if I
Yes.
might, the point that you made about Mac and Barb. 20 years ago when I managed Edison's Clean Air Technologies programs, and that was at a time when companies or industry really didn't have a facility or a location where they could be demonstrated. And that's what we did. And I think to the benefit of a lot of businesses and the environment too. The Edison doesn't do that any longer, but I know the gas company with their ERC does. And what bothers me is when I see somebody come before the governing board, a rainmaker, if you will, and say, hey, I just got the device or
the snake oil
machine. Yeah, and largely you have a non-technical board. No engineers or scientists, political appointees. That's not speaking pejoratively, but it gets very confusing at times. And just to have a technology be achieved in practice for 6 months, if it was that good, businesses would do that, not for the environment, but for their bottom line. So
save them money.
Yeah, maybe the district might want to entertain, some of these promising technologies, maybe some beta sites or something like that, and invite businesses to them to see it.
Yeah.
You do get maybe a competition problem with the owner, but nevertheless.
With the promise of some recognition and some assistance, that would be a really good idea. Because asking someone to disrupt their normal process and take that risk of trying out something that might be better, it is kind of taking one for the team. So I would encourage that. Yeah. I'm always happy to see businesses that do that. Kristen.
One other area that I heard at the Air Board's meeting that I didn't think to extend an invitation to is the planning departments of local governments, and county and city of LA particularly have we have a green zones program, City Delays clean up, green up, and having, like, imagine potential nominated jurisdictions are going to include at least those two places, but if there's other cities that we can imagine, we might need to start having conversations on the land use side to do early invitations to those.
And certainly a place where the qualitative may trump the quantitative, the land use planning. But we also know that, you know, I've always said, you know, show me an environmental justice problem, I'll show you a bad land use decision.
Yeah, so that they're extremely connected,
Yeah,
and the board
and
recognizes
once they're
that,
made,
and
it
we
takes
all know
100
that
years
here
to
too.
undo them, so we need to start investing now in addressing that, and so, yeah, absolutely. Although it's not explicit in 617, as far as I know, I think you're absolutely right. Good. Any other questions, comments on this issue we've beaten to death, even to the extent that lunch did show up? And for those of you on the phone, we're having lobster and filet mignon today. You're welcome to join us next time, where we may or may not have the same menu. Any public comments? We've already exhausted our public comments. Okay, that takes us to agenda item number 5, which is the California Air Resources Board. Chris, or wait, who do we have? Wasn't Chris?
Johnny Raymond.
Johnny Raymond.
I'm going to be providing the update.
Okay.
So, as you saw in your packet, some upcoming ARB activities is our board hearing coming up on November 16th. And as you can see, there's a couple of consent items, both SIP related. In addition, on greenhouse gas programs, we have the SB 375, where we'll present to the board an updated regional greenhouse gas reduction targets for passenger vehicles as required by 375. In addition, we plan to bring to the board the proposed fiscal year 17-18 plan for the AQIP. And we plan to bring proposed amendments to the PERP reg as well. So that's coming up in our upcoming board hearing. In addition, I wanted to mention some other related CARB efforts that are going on, and you may have received these if you subscribe to our listservs. So we have an EJAC community meeting, or a committee meeting coming up on the 13th. And so that'll be here in Sacramento, but if you're not able to come here, there will be a webcast available. And this group is forming recommendations on the AB 32 scoping plan. In addition, we have a public meeting coming up on the 14th, and this is to discuss air quality monitoring in neighborhoods near oil and gas facilities. And this event will be here in Sacramento, but will also be webcast in case you want to tune in. Also related to the 617 discussions, we will have, and I think it was mentioned on the earlier 617 update, a San Diego community meeting to talk about the freight activities, and that's coming up November 28th. And so that's in National City. And so that's going to be teeing up a couple of the items that you heard in South Coast Air Quality Plan, as well as in our mobile source strategy. And so that's discussing concepts of a potential indirect source rule to target large freight facilities, but to also talk about outreach and other related meetings to really understand the relative pros and cons about pursuing reductions for freight facilities, and really to discuss that in the open public forum. So those are some activities that are on the horizon that you may have interest in wanting to tune into. And it's my update.
Great. Kristen, you?
Yeah, I wanted to clarify that the SB 375 item is actually not going in November. I've received a notice that it's being delayed, and I've heard that it was supposed to be delayed till December, but probably will be delayed again, just to share that piece.
This is Karen. I can say, right, my understanding is, right, it is not going in November, but it is slated for December.
I just heard that asked to be moved again.
Okay. All right, great.
great. Any questions, comments? Anyone on the phone? Members of the public? Okay. Philip Crab has been sitting here very patiently for the better part of an hour and 39 minutes.
In a pay status.
Yes, about to give us a legislative update.
Yes. So basically the summary, we had our October legislative committee that I will summarize. There will be no November committee. Just it's a little bit of a dead time in terms of activity, official activity. There's a lot of behind the scenes stuff that's still going on, but federal legislative issues. We had a report. There's written reports again for state and federal. I did see some legislative packets, so if you haven't grabbed one already, there's the written reports. These were verbal updates that we're giving at the meeting. In particular, in regards to possible future, at the federal level, possible future infrastructure legislation, it was stated that President Trump actually might be more amenable to putting more federal money into the current proposed package. However, the public focuses on tax reform right now. But infrastructure, our consultants are anticipating that'll be the next big thing coming up late this year, but more likely maybe early next year. Also, the EPA came out with a repeal notice on the Clean Power Plan from the Obama administration. And while this action was not unexpected, the EPA was taking a different approach to what the Clean Air Act allows and what the authority is regarding regulating power plants. The EPA adjusted the cost-benefit analysis, which was a major announcement in DC. It's also reported that the Department of Energy released a proposal which would potentially provide the ability to charge higher rates for energy generated from coal and nuclear facilities. It was stated that the proposal is in the form of a petition to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC. It's not a legislative proposal. It's believed that it would put at a disadvantage any type of energy developer that is other than coal or nuclear. And this proposal's got some tight timelines, so a lot of folks that work on energy in DC are watching that pretty closely. The proposal's potential impacts to the energy market would be very significant, but our consultants were not able to, they said it was very difficult to predict any kind of outcome for this kind of very unusual proposal. So we'll continue to monitor that. Also, the Senate Appropriations Committee announced that its markup of the Interior Appropriations Bill, which oversees EPA's budget, will occur soon. The House has already completed its appropriations work and is waiting for the Senate's version of the bill. The congressional session runs through December 8th, although there has been talk by congressional leadership about possibly extending until Christmas in an effort to get the tax bill completed. So we'll see how that goes. It was also reported that there was a staff trip to DC that occurred October 17th to 19th, and some of the issues, they visited the Vice President's office and other congressional offices, and the folks there was to talk about the glider kit issue, which is dealing with truck retrofit rules, Diesel Emission Reduction Act reauthorization legislation, and an effort to add clean air funding to any future infrastructure legislation that might occur. On the state side, kind of a rehashing in a sense because the governor now has had time to act since our last meeting. So quick review, the legislature adjourned September 15th. Over 1,300 bills were sent to the governor, and he had up to October 15th to act. At the committee, there was a presentation, kind of an end-of-year wrap-up. So as part of that, of course, our two sponsored bills that we've talked about in the past, AB 1274, which is relating to smog abatement fees, and AB 1132, which is dealing with also basically the power for the executive officer to issue an order of abatement on substantial and endangerment type situations for toxics. Both of those bills were passed and signed into law by the governor. So that was a great occurrences for AQMD to get both of our sponsors' bills passed and signed. The smog check bill basically is going to defer about $30 million per year additional monies to the South Coast region starting in 2019. And there's no sunset date for that. So that's an ongoing source of funding, and it'll be great in terms of helping to meet our attainment needs. And 1132, that will be a critical new tool to help protect disadvantaged communities from serious toxic emission situations such as we had in Paramount and potentially in other places like Compton that we're looking at now. Of course, cap and trade program we've talked about in the past, so that's AB 398 that extended the cap and trade program to 2030 to get reduction targets of 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. That was good in terms of solidifying our options, cap and trade options, generate all this money we've been talking about. But again, just to quickly review, AB 109 and AB 134 allocated $1.5 billion in GGRF monies. Most of that's been talked about already in terms of $27 million statewide for implementation of AB 617, at least for the first year. And that $107.5 million specifically for Carl Moyer funding or Prop 1B usage that would come to the South Coast. And that's again just for 1 year. Additional about $645 million. I can, I'll go into a couple of them. $180 million for the HVIP program, which is the Hybrid Zero Emission Truck and Bus Voucher Incentive Program. $140 million for the CVRP. That's rebates for light duty or cars, vehicles. $140 million for equipment and improvement at ports. And $100 million for the EFMP, or what we have, our Replace Your Ride program here, and $85 million for reducing agricultural emissions through retrofitting and replacing agricultural heavy-duty equipment. There's also
$50 million for warehouses.
Exactly, and there's a few bills that we had discussed. AB 615, which would extend the income caps for the CVRP program. That was signed into law. AB 739, which would require at least 15% of heavy-duty vehicles purchased by state agencies to be zero emission by 2025, and at least 30% of those vehicles to be zero emission by 2030, was signed into law. And we've talked about AB 1647, which is the refinery bill that will affect our Rule 1180. The last bit of action that was considered, there was a federal bill, HR 3682, by Congressmember Alan Lowenthal, called the Blue Whales and Blue Skies Act. That was a proposal basically to establish through the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration a excellence awards program to basically recognize shipping companies that voluntarily reduce speeds in the Santa Barbara Channel region to 12 knots. And the goal here basically would be to reduce air emissions, but also fatal strikes on whales in the oceans. Within 4 years, there would be an assessment as to whether or not to extend that along the entire coast between Canada and Mexico. If that were the case, it would help reduce NOx emissions within the South Coast region as well. Staff recommended a support position on that bill. However, the legislative committee basically took the position to not support that bill. That's what was the order of the day, and that was reaffirmed by the board at the last meeting, and that's my report.
Questions or comments? Either spoke so quickly that no one could understand. They have no questions or comments. Okay, then we can thanks, Bill. We can go to item number 7, which is litigation and related EPA actions.
Thank you, Dr.
Wong.
I just have one update. This is for case number 9 on the litigation status report I provided. Essentially, that is the case that was filed against the district when they amended reclaim in December 2015. We had a hearing on that date. However, the decision is not final, so I just want to emphasize that. But there was a tentative decision, which again is not final, which did not go into the merits of the case, but simply found a procedural error to be conducted by the district. Essentially, the judge felt that the hearing should have been put off by another month because there were substantial changes in the meaning of the rule. There was some oral argument about that, and the judge has agreed to kind of reconsider it and consider those arguments, and we hope to hear from her within the next month or so. For some good news, both the petitioner and us, we also understood that obviously invalidating the reclaim rules at this point would create a real big mess with the industry itself. Both sides seem to agree that perhaps a temporary stay on any ruling to validate the rule might be appropriate. So she'll take that into consideration too. With that, that concludes my report. Here to answer any questions?
Jackie, really, you have a question
Yeah.
about this?
So best case scenario, there's just stay, nothing happens with the program. Worst case scenario, there's needs to be, we revert back to the 14-ton reduction.
No, 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 no.
Back to no reduction.
You mean
No
no
reduction.
report, yeah,
Yeah.
and another consideration by the governing board.
There's bigger implications for the freedom the board would have to make changes on board day. That's what is really,
Right, it was just postponed because
yeah.
they felt that the board should have continued it for another month, or she should have tentatively.
So the law says something about you can't make substantial changes and and have your CEQA, right? No,
Well,
your rulemaking, the set hearing, substantial changes from what was
Originally.
30-day
originally
Right, 30-day
proposed,
package,
the 30-day package, need another 30 days, but the judge's definition of substantial and our definition of substantial may actually differ. And so then there's some question is what really are the parameters of substantial? You know, if we add a comma, is that substantial? I mean, I guess it could be. But certainly if you toss out a couple of tons, the judge seems to think that was substantial enough to require a second 30-day notice package. At least initially.
Right.
We'll see
No
what
final
she thinks
decision.
in the end. You know, we also got close to 13 tons that day, and I'm really wondering whether 13 tons would have been substantial or not.
The compromise?
Well, you know, it does make you wonder, right? I mean, it'd be good to know because you don't want to be breaking the law when you're making those decisions, but you also need to know how much discretion you have when you're making those decisions. And I think you probably would agree that going through another reclaim shave process would not be an enjoyable experience.
No, especially with the
Did the
current.
markets react when this tentative ruling came out?
No, I haven't seen anything. Not at
Well, I
all.
think Mark is affected more about our focus on.
Yes,
ending
the
reclaim.
Yes,
sunset.
that's true.
That's
That
far.
has made an impact.
That is actually, yeah, I don't know how we get above and beyond that uncertainty. Yeah.
Okay, any other questions on the litigation update? None? Okay, subcommittee reports, great sustainability, Dan is not here,
I can report out for Dan.
there we go.
In the interest of time, and I'm gonna apologize because I have to leave a little bit early today, but, as I'm sure most of you know, the CAP, the Ports Cleaner Action Plan was adopted, just last week. We understand that South Coast had concern, about the 2023 date to begin charging the penalty fee for heavy-duty trucks that were not, zero or near zero. And that date had been changed, or was changed to 2019, something that SoCal Gas also was supporting and others as well. I'd note that the new heavy-duty 12-liter Cummins Westport engine will be available in 2018, two different versions, but we're understanding Q2 2018, so that would fit that timeline very nicely. That, I guess that's that update on the CAP. Let's see, Dan sent me some notes, so apologies that I'm reading here. He also wanted to mention that the draft California Rail Plan was released for public review on October 11th with a comment deadline of December 11th. And there'll be upcoming workshops in November in San Bernardino and Los Angeles. And that rail plan establishes the state priorities for freight. That is the gist of the report. I'm happy to talk a little bit more about the Cleaner Action Plan if we want to, but I know a lot of people in this room are very familiar with that, so I don't want to waste anybody's
I would rather not relive it, but if other people would like to talk about it, I'd be happy to. Bill, do you have any more or different small business consideration updates?
Yeah.
Okay, what are they?
Well, since our last meeting, the Small Business Committee, Subcommittee participated in two reclaim working group meetings, and also for 1469, 2 working group meetings, one actually in Compton, which actually went a lot better than I thought it would, but it was very productive. We also participated in a AQMP funding working group meeting, and that was on the 2nd. And I guess that there's going to be another one here in a few more months or something like that.
And you found us $14 billion?
No, we didn't, but they had us break out into working groups, and there were a lot of good ideas. Denny Zane and I were at the same table, and
What'd you think?
yeah, we had probably more in common than we differed on. I think to some extent, well, to a large extent, our goals are the same. How to improve the quality of air without, doing damage to the economy. And, he was advocating for a balanced approach, and so was I and the rest of us at the table. So I guess, to be determined, more. The other thing, on September 28th, I had arranged for the leadership of the Korean Dry Cleaners and Laundry Association and the California Cleaners Association to have a demonstration or a walkthrough on the district's new e-permit system in this room. And we also provided some suppliers to that sell equipment and consumables to especially the dry cleaners. And there were a lot of questions. I think we had around maybe about 11 or 12 people here. They're all set to go, and finally, through David Ono's good work, staff did succeed in doing a bilingual translation on the instructions on that site.
So is the site both in Korean and English?
No, the site is that was a question that I raised months ago with Lockheed, and it was raised again by the people who attended the meeting. There does need to be more than a single language on that site, whether it's Korean or Tagalog or whatever, Farsi, and I realize that that's going to take time.
Yeah.
But there are a number of off ramps in here as the applicant goes through. If it turns out that they're at 900 feet or 750 feet to a sensitive receptor or school, you can complete the process, but you're not going to get a permit issued.
Right.
And it's going to direct you to an engineer, and there are other exceptions too. But that needed to be made clear to the applicants. And in the case of the Koreans, who are major stakeholders in dry cleaning, it really had to be in their language. First and second generation folks, they're steadfast. They're not going to learn English. Third and fourth, yes, not a problem. So David saw to that, or oversaw that, that the translation was there, and that is up on your website now. So,
generally speaking, I mean, the online application process, though, I mean, it shows promise, right?
well,
Especially after giving, I mean, absent the learning curve, which everyone's going to have to deal with,
there's going
right?
to be bugs in it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Lockheed claims, or he and Ron seem to claim that it's possible to get a permit issued in 30 minutes. I said, we'll see. They're trying to reduce the backlog now, but if it can appreciably shorten that time and make it more user-friendly or customer-friendly, that would be a big step forward.
That's great. Thank you. EJ, update outside of AB 617.
Well, and then the card people reported on everything else that I was gonna talk about.
Okay.
The upcoming meetings on the monitoring in neighborhoods near oil and gas facilities and the freight one in down San Diego, so I have nothing other than that to report.
That covers everything. Okay. Climate change activities.
Get a report on the scoping plan. That last month, CARB released the latest draft of the 2017 climate change scoping plan that outlines how we're going to get GHG reductions 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. And the latest draft is sort of was on hold since the summer and picked up again after the latest round of legislation. The latest draft makes changes from earlier drafts in accordance with recently adopted AB 398 regarding cap and trade. And probably the most significant change in the document is a removal of the measure calling for a targeted 20% reduction in GHG emissions from oil and gas facilities, and the subsequent increase in emission reductions assigned to cap and trade, which is now calling for 294 million metric tons of CO2e by 2030. So the majority is coming from cap and trade, followed by the short-lived climate pollutant measure. And also the drafts incorporating some other changes based on recent legislation and greater inclusion of EJ concerns and priorities. And this scoping plan should go to the CARB board at their December 14th meeting. That's all I have.
Okay, thank you. Any questions or comments on any of the subcommittee updates? All right, we'll move to report to and from Stationary Source Committee from Dr. Fine.
Okay, really quickly, in October, as Kirk has mentioned, it's been a very busy Stationary Source Committee agenda over the last several months, and that will continue. We presented on, Lockie presented on the permit backlog. He did the same thing at the board. We talked about 1148.3, actually took it off the calendar, so Kurt works both ways when we go to Stationary Source Committee. 1466, Rule 1180, Reclaim Quarterly Report, and then a very brief update on TBAC and where OEHA is with that. This is very preliminary agenda, not finalized yet for next week. We'd like to, there's an action item on issuing an RFP for a rebate program for the lower NOx natural gas fired fan type central furnaces as part of Rule 1111. The committee before had talked about a consumer rebate in addition to mitigation fees that would also be due from the manufacturers. And then we also have informational items looking at our proposed amendments to Rule 1111 that will be coming early next year. Looking at, talking about, we have a meeting later today on Rule 2001-2002 and the reclaim to stop facilities from coming in to reclaim, some simple amendments there. We'll be briefing Stationary Source Committee on that, and then another briefing on 1469, Susan will be providing. That's preliminary, could change between now and Friday.
That was last month.
Yeah.
Okay, any questions or comments on that?
Well, depending, 1469 could be
could
a lot
last
of
a while.
It's going to be a busy day.
The California Air Resources Board is working with or demanding of the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District a PM 2.5 SIP submission that appears to include commitments on under fire char boilers. Have you guys been following that?
Yeah, and they've been following us. We have this ongoing work with CSERT on trying to find some more cost-effective controls.
It looks to me like they're just basically going to buy it. He's going to pay the extra money and do it.
They're looking at that.
Yeah.
We're hoping to find something that's less than $50,000 to
Yeah,
get maybe not 90% control, but 30 to 60% control. So it's still, the project's had some fits and starts out at Riverside for various reasons, but we're pulling it together.
If it makes it into their AQMP and gets adopted into the SIP by EPA, then it becomes a feasible measure.
Yes, we actually included it as a potential, I'm not sure if it was contingency or not, but we did talk about, we do have a measure in the RHOP regarding that.
All right, any other questions or comments on agenda item number 9? Home Rule Advisory Group meeting schedule for next year, pending last minute crazy demands of my schedule. Everyone get a chance to see that, it's toward the end of the packet here. It's the same timing, I think. I don't think there were any exceptions. Janet, do you know when your SEED summer issue seminar is next year?
We are all clear in July. Thank you for asking.
Yeah.
It'll be the following week after homework.
That always messes me up. Okay, so any other questions, comments on that? We will consider it approved. The accomplishments from this year and goals and objectives for next year. It's nice that it's strike through so we can see how things have changed for the goals and objectives. The accomplishments are a rehash of everything we've already done. Please let me know if you have any recommendations to change either of those. And if not, it goes to the board for its information, I think. We're taking consensus building off. Yes? Bill.
Yeah. I have a comment and certainly a very strong suggestion. I submitted my accomplishments for this year with Home Rule, and I submitted 4 of them.
For small business considerations?
For small business considerations. Here are the ones that I submitted, Dr. Liu. When I received the package back, there were only 3. The one for Rule 1147 was just struck out. In all the time that I have served on this working group, other working groups and committees, where goals and objectives were required, I've never had an accomplishment that was just dismissed out of hand.
And do you know what happened with that?
I don't. It's probably my fault, and I apologize.
It's a complete error. There's
Yeah.
no,
Okay, well, if it's an error, that's fine. Because I kind of came loaded for bear.
Yeah. It was an honest mistake, trust me.
Yes.
If
Pretty
this
factual. Yeah.
If this is a work in progress, we can.
Yeah, nothing's final. This is all
Nothing's
draft
final.
right now.
Why don't we take that back to staff, have them look it over, see whether they agree with your interpretation in the second paragraph and then incorporate it in if we can. And staff can work with you on exactly what they're proposing to do.
we have time. This needs to go to the board by February, which means it needs to go to stationary source at the latest January.
All right, so let's resolve it certainly before
Is that correct,
January.
Dan?
We can do it on January meeting, then go to stationary source.
We have oh yeah, is the stationary, what's the timing of the January meeting? Our January meeting's before stationary source. Right. So yeah, we should do that.
But there's going to be no stationary source in December.
Right. So that's okay, it'll just have to go in January.
January stationary, February 4th.
Sounds good.
This is meant, we put this out there so people can have comments back and forth.
So please work with Bill on the language.
Yeah, I was wondering why it was so early, but it's now, because we're meeting every other, but.
Yes, exactly.
So, yeah.
We have to plan 4 months in advance to get these things done. Okay, that, I think, takes us to agenda item number 12, which is other business. Is there any other business? Any public comment? We have no one here. Anyone at the remote locations? Okay, and we can adjourn. Yeah, we meet again on January 10th, we just discussed, right here in CC8, and all you folks on the phone. So thanks again for coming, everyone. Oh, yeah, just
Sidebar.
We're adjourned. This is the sidebar conversation. Anyway, thanks again. We're gonna hang up. Take care.
I
Bye.
would respond, I'm sure everybody else.